Hello everyone, Brian McKenzie from Critical Skills, and today's lecture is about information creation as a process. This is one of the frames of the Association for College and Research Libraries Information Framework for Higher Education. Of the 6 frames, this is probably one of my favorite because it's got a sort of a meta level of applicability. When I talk about this frame, when I read about or think about this frame, I see very easy sort of connections and transferability between the ideas behind this frame and sort of applicability in the real world, in academic research and other things like that. So that's what we're going to talk about is this frame, information creation as a process. And I'll start with a few simple diagrams of kind of information outcomes or products, if you will, to illustrate or to introduce the frame. I have a book here, for the sake of argument, we'll say it's volume 1 of Das Kapital. I attempted to draw the Wikipedia logo, globe. This is a phone that says podcast and it's got like earphones. Couldn't afford the Bluetooth earbuds. And then this is a peer-reviewed journal, the Lancet, which is a very famous, important medical journal. So whatever the sort of product or the information sources that you're consuming, it's important to understand that this was the outcome of a process, right? That there is a huge amount of sort of underlying processes that resulted in the actual creation of this information source. And it's very important to understand how these underlying processes affect information, how it's viewed, how it's presented, how it's consumed. And if you have a better understanding of the processes underlying the different sort of formats of information, you'll have a better understanding or a better way of being able to evaluate the sources and information sources. Okay, so specifically, the key concepts and ideas for this lecture, we want to talk about capabilities and constraints, and we'll get into more detail, but it's basically about how the format affects and enables and limits information and ideas. We'll talk about discipline-specific processes, right? And then we'll talk about the packaging matters, and this will relate to the next point, but the final presentation, the context, if you will, of the information will matter in terms of how people view its authority. And this does lead into the next point, and that is that format does not equal the creation process. So when you look at the final product of something or the information source, it can be a fallacy to equate what you're consuming or listening to or seeing or reading with the process that created that. Then there's a huge disconnect between the final product and the creation process. And it's not clear that it's not implicit. In other words, it's not obvious when you're looking at something what the underlying process was that created this source of information. Okay? And then finally, matching information needs and appropriate sources. So particularly for academic assignments, the information needs you're going to have will tend to be relatively high level. And so it's very important that you understand what the needs are in terms of the information, and then what's an appropriate source. Okay. I have better luck with my easel. Okay. Let's go to the first point we're talking about, and that's capabilities and constraints. So every information source that we consume, the format offers some advantages and disadvantages in terms of its presentation, its accessibility, and other things like that. And what's very important to understand is that you recognize the capabilities and constraints of the type of information source, and then for your own sake, when you're writing or creating information, you recognize that and you take advantage of it, right? So if a certain format has some distinct advantages, it's important that you embrace and maximize those advantages. If a certain format has some disadvantages or some constraints, you need to reflect on how that will affect your research and your authorship as you put it together. Okay, so we'll go through just a few different capabilities and constraints. To me, one of the most important ones is accessibility, and there's a lot of different facets to accessibility as a constraint and a capability. So, for example, is it easy to share? Just that's one level of accessibility. Is it easy to share? If it's a physical book, it's easy to share with somebody you kind of know or meet, but not that easy to share with somebody far away. Is it a web page? In that case, it's easy to share if the other person has internet access. Formatting. So just in terms of accessibility, in terms of formatting, can people who, can people access it who may not have, they may be colorblind or have some other sight issues, maybe deaf. I mean, just in terms of the formatting has potential to increase accessibility as well as restrict accessibility. And also in terms of accessibility, I put target audience down here. So part of accessibility also relates to your choice of terms, language, and things like that. And depending on who your target audience is, then you may make different choices in terms of the language you use, the terminology you use. Okay. Time is another interesting factor in terms of capabilities and constraints. So we'll talk, for example, about books and peer-reviewed journals. These are kind of the bread and butter of your academic assignments, and they take a very, very long time to be published, and that's actually a constraint. Whereas in terms of the internet, web pages, things like that, the ability to instantaneously publish is a capability. And I put down here the kind of visual, audio, text. These are all issues that relate to accessibility, but also sort of relate to capabilities and constraints. So if you're making a web page, you might have the the capability to do some fantastic visual and audio things that you can't do in a text. HTML5 does fantastic stuff for web pages now. Of course, again, there's a question of you're assuming people have decent internet and bandwidth and things like that, but then you can really enhance content with visual, audio, assets. Okay, so when you're kind of choosing the format of the information, kind of that you're making a podcast, a book, a website, or something like that, it's really important to understand and reflect on the capabilities and constraints, and you want to definitely take these into consideration. The last thing I have there is I have a euro and a dollar sign. That again relates back to accessibility. A lot of the peer-reviewed journals that you have access to cost a lot, and that's a question that you want to make in terms of accessibility. There's the whole other dedicated lecture on information has value that you can refer to. But when you think of information creation as a process, as you create information, as you go through that process of creating information, you do want to think about how much is the end product going to cost in terms of the price.